Alrighty, I guess we'll get started here. So today, hopefully, we'll finish talking about quantitative sampling, and then from there, we'll talk about structured observation, and then that's the last topic prior to reading week, and then the midterm, right? So hopefully I think we can get through all of that this week, and we're pretty much right on schedule. It looks like I think everybody got their feedback back for the mini lab 2. There is, of course, lab tomorrow where you'll be working on survey design. Excuse me. So, and that again is at 9 a.m. and I think 3:30. So, and if you need to switch, just go. It's in the same room for both at the opposite time. Okay. So last time, we basically ended talking about stratified sampling right this way, where basically, in order to, sorry, excuse me, just had a little bit of a cough. In order to get a sample that resembles your population in terms of the proportion of, say, groups within your population, you basically kind of split it up into strata. So like, if you're looking at a student population, right, and 40% of your student population is engineers, you make sure that, if you take 10 as your total sample, 4 of them are from the faculty of engineering. So that's basically a stratified sample. Okay, and I said I didn't have time to do this on Wednesday, but this is multi-stage cluster sampling, and it sounds way more complex than it needs to be. It actually, makes it's pretty simple once you actually kind of break it down. Generally speaking, excuse me, geez. I didn't have a cough until just this moment. You use it for really large populations or geographically dispersed populations where you want to make sure that you're adequately sampling from a bunch of different sites, right? So basically it involves a couple of stages. Basically you select a cluster or group of elements and then subunits within that cluster. So one of the kind of classic examples, if you wanted to think about it, is if you wanted to try and figure out what's going on at Canadian universities, right? You wanted to just figure out do some kind of research at a bunch of different Canadian universities. You wanted to get an idea of, say, the student experience or educational outcomes for students at different Canadian universities, right? Because you have them kind of geographically distributed, you would split, your universities into clusters, right? So let's say you wanted to pick, you would start with like Quebec and Ontario and the Maritimes, and you have those as clusters, and then the Prairies and British Columbia, right? So each of these would represent, a cluster, right? So there are going to be universities within that. So you split them each into these clusters, right? And then from there, you kind of select from under those, different cases within each, right? So in Quebec, right, you would, get McGill and UQAM. And then in Ontario, right, you pick a bunch of universities that you want to do there. You might want it to be representative of the number of students in the country. So maybe you oversample in Ontario, or you sample in Ontario, a percentage, whatever. The Maritimes, right, you pick, let's say Dalhousie and University of New Brunswick. The Prairies, U of A, University of Saskatchewan, University of Manitoba, and then BC, UBC and University of Victoria or something, right? So you grab, basically from within those clusters so that you're getting a representation from all over the country, right, in terms of universities in different regions. You basically pick the universities, and then from there, sorry, I ran out of room on my chart. Obviously then, so you got your schools, you select your schools within these regions, and then from each of these schools, you would branch down further into selecting your particular units of analysis, right? So the students that you're going to be surveying, right? So that's basically all multi-stage cluster sampling is basically you want to get, a representation from, say, especially in this case, right, a geographically dispersed population and you want to make sure every kind of region gets some kind of representation. So you pick, you split up the country into regions. From there, you pick the universities, or if you want to do research in cities, right, you could pick cities, right? Montreal, Quebec, Toronto, Ottawa, Halifax, Fredericton. I'm like, are there other cities in the Maritimes? I guess Fredericton. The Prairies, Winnipeg, Saskatoon, Edmonton, Calgary, in BC, Vancouver, Victoria, Kelowna maybe, right? But basically, right, and then from there you can then get your units, right? So who actually are you going to sample within that, right? So down kind of at the, it looks like stars here, right? But basically that's it. That's all multi-stage cluster sampling is. Again, you do it for, I think, typically geographical kind of spread, and making sure you're getting, a representation from all the different clusters within it. I mean, you could do this in lots of different ways, right? Let's say you even wanted to make sure that you're, if you're looking at University of Alberta, right, you could have as your clusters, right, the different faculties, and then the different departments within those faculties, and then, if there's any subunits within that, that could be another one, and then you grab your actual sample of students or faculty or whatever that you want to survey from below that. So like I said, it sounds really complicated, and actually this is a terrible graph because it makes everything look much more complicated than it has to be. But that's all there is to multi-stage cluster sampling, right? Does that make sense? Okay, good. Yeah, so issues with it, and why people might not use it and often just use something like simple random sampling or stratified sampling. It is technically complicated to set up, right? Making sure that you get the right clusters, that you can distribute your research tool within those clusters is technically quite difficult, right? And making sure you get the representation with all of those places or sites can be really, really challenging. Yeah, they're often stratified as well. Cluster samples often have strata within them. And so you will tend to need to pull really large sample sizes if you're going to get a truly representative sample, especially to make sure that within each of your kind of strata under your clusters, you're getting a representative sample of those populations, right? So if you're talking, you want to look at university students across Canada, it's probably going to take you a large sample at each site to get, a representative sample to make sure you're capturing, say, the richness of the U of A or University of Toronto, right? So really, really large sample sizes tend to be required in all of these cases. So, I mean, that's just, some of the challenges. It can be really difficult to actually do it, and it is probably the most expensive form of sampling and the most difficult one, just because you are, going across these multiple sites, and it's really complicated to set up. It may involve researchers at all of these different sites, depending on how you're doing it, because you may need people with sort of local knowledge. Okay, let's talk about sample size in general. So, basically, your proportion of your population doesn't really matter, right? Generally speaking, when you're talking about, a sample, you're never getting anything more than in most cases, right? Especially in complex societies, you're never getting any more than a really small fraction of the population as part of your sample anyway. So don't worry about, saying, oh, we sampled, a certain percentage of the population. That doesn't matter. What matters is the absolute size of the sample that you're looking at, right? So how many people did you get in? And, as sample size increases, sampling error usually decreases because you're going to get, much more data, much closer in terms of margin and error. And the one I'm forgetting. Why is my brain not working today? Oh, hang on. I got to go back to because the term is escaping me, and I know it's going to drive me crazy. Confidence interval, right? The confidence level. Sorry about that. The confidence interval, right? Okay, so most common sample sizes, right? When you look at surveys, 100 is very, very small, right? 100 is going to be really, really challenging to do anything with that data at the end of the day. Like 100 is so small that in terms of like running any kind of regressions, it's going to be basically impossible. You're at the level, you're stuck at the level of basic correlations, kind of cross-matching, categories, or cross-tabulating categories rather, and not a whole lot else at 100. At 400, right? 400 is sort of the bare minimum. And so like when you're writing your major labs and you come to the section on sampling, what I'd say is 400 should be your minimum sample, right? Like even if you punch into the calculator, right, either the one I gave you or another one you find online, and you find that it's giving you 350 as a sample size, just bump it up to 400. And it's kind of a rough number, but all of my statistician friends will say anything smaller than 400, like linear regressions and multi-factor regressions, become really, really difficult. 400 is like the magic number at which you can do a lot more with the data. More is always better if you can afford it once you're doing research. But again, that's neither here nor there. So common size 900 or 1,000. Some people may like to make it a round. 1,000, 1,600. 2,500, 3,000 is also a sample that I see a lot out there. And at each of those stages, basically, you roughly, you cut the sampling error in smaller and smaller increments, right? So when you go from 100 to 400, it's cut in half. When you go from 400 to 900, it's about a third. When you go from 900 to 1,600, you cut it by about an extra quarter. And then, from 1,600 to 2,500, only by an extra fifth. Right? So as you grow the sample, the value of getting a bigger and bigger sample becomes smaller and smaller, right? Still, you're going to get better results that are closer to, eliminating sampling error and sampling bias, but the benefit gets smaller and smaller the bigger you get, and the biggest change happens between 1 and 400, right? Where the sampling error is basically cut in half. So again, I would say, magic number for a lot of research, especially sort of initial projects, 400 is really, really good number. It's very workable. It creates lots of statistics you can work with. And yeah, you got to always ask yourself, if you're doing a project that you're thinking, should I get a bigger sample, right? What's the benefit, right? Is the increased size worth the time and effort? Especially if you're doing something like structured interviews, right, where you have to sit there, or phone interviews where it's going to cost and it's going to be time consuming. And yeah, often sample size is dictated by financial concerns, right? I think when I did 400 person surveys in the Edmonton area, it was about $8,000, and that was a few years ago. So if you, and I could have done them nationally too, for about the same price, but if you're going to get any bigger than that, right, you're then into over $10,000. And usually that's where, especially in academic research, money can be really, really limited unless you have a big like SHRC Insight or SHRC partnership grant. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, so yeah, when you get to this part on the major lab, right, like I said, minimum number, I would say for the most part should be 400. You can go bigger than that, and there's no reason you shouldn't do that. And then if you should pick one of these sampling methods that we talked about, right? The most straightforward one is always going to be, some kind of, and I think the one where you're going to get the best results typically is simple random sampling. That's the easiest one to work with if you have a population for which it is conducive, right? So if you're talking about a geographic area, it works really well because you can just do it by phone number or postal code or address, and then select within that population. If you were doing students, right, you can do it by student number and assign a random number to them and all of this fun stuff. So just honestly keep that in mind. Everything else becomes more and more problematic. Systemic sampling, you can introduce a lot of sample errors in it, and trying to explain how you're going to do multi-stage cluster sampling. I've seen students do it well. I've also seen students explain it so poorly that it makes it clear they didn't understand the concept. So it's probably, for your purposes in the major lab, best to avoid it unless you have a really good reason. Okay, sorry, does that make sense? Okay, I'm not trying to scare you off of it, but just be aware as you're writing these. Simple random is you can almost never go wrong, and it's easy to describe how you're going to do it. So keep that in mind. Okay. All right. Issues with sample size. So we talked about non-response, right? When we talked about surveys, non-response is generally a huge problem with any kind of sampling, right? Because let's say you're doing simple random sampling, right? There's no, and you pick students. You have all the student numbers of every student in the U of A, in this make-believe world where you can get any information that you want, and you assign each of them a number randomly, and then you randomly select which numbers are going to, be surveyed, right? Non-response is going to happen, right? And like I said, in some cases now, we're talking even with major research organizations, non-response rates in the 90s, which is a huge problem. And really calls into question some of the ways we do research and whether our findings are valid. But that's a question for a different time. So the response rate is the percentage of the sample that participates in the study, right? So, if it's, like I said, I think last time, in the past, we used to consider anything like below 70 or 80% basically a bad sample. And you would throw out the whole study and try again. Because non-response has become such a problem, I think now we're kind of aiming for about 10% response, which means, just something to keep in mind. If you need 400 responses and you're going to get, a non-response rate of 80%, right? You're going to have to send out a lot of surveys to get your 400 responses. So just keep that in mind, right? If, that's something that we kind of have to expect, and you can't just be like, I'm going to send out 400 surveys and get 400 answers. That doesn't work anymore. You're probably going to see a non-response rate somewhere in the, assume at least 50%. So, would need to double it. Yeah, please.
So for your survey a few years ago, how many surveys do you actually conduct?
So I got 400 responses. It required it to be sent out to 1,800 people to get the 400 responses.
And the 1,800 was worth 8,000?
Sorry?
And the 1,800 was worth 8,000?
Yeah. Well, so to get my 400 responses, basically they were like, okay, we need to send it out to 1,800 people, and that's going to cost you, that $8,000. It went up quite a bit. Like if we wanted to go to 1,000, I think it was $15,000. So it was expensive. And I haven't checked the prices. It's easy to email Abacus or Leger and just be like, hey, I'm thinking of doing a survey. Quote me a price. But I suspect it's probably gone up because everything's gotten more expensive, even though their platforms are not any more expensive than they were in the past. But yeah, it's pricey to do this kind of internet-based research. It's still cheaper than having, let's say that I would say probably non-response on phone is higher. So imagine having to have someone sit there and phone dial just randomly numbers until you get to 400 people that answer, right? That's going to take days and weeks, maybe months to get your 400 respondents. It gets even more expensive, right? You're into easily tens of thousands of dollars with phone surveys, which is why almost no one's doing them anymore.
So for the response rate, we should like assume to have to do multiple. Like how many multiple times 400 do we have to like assume to do for us to get like the response?
I mean,
because you did 1,800 and those are like 400.
It's very platform dependent, and this is a good question, but it's really, really hard to know, right? Because like internet, the reason internet tends to have a lower non-response rate is because on these panels, everybody signed up, right? So they signed up to be part of these panels, right? And so basically, there's kind of an assumption that they want to do surveys, right? Which again, creates a little bit of a bias in the sample because they are people who are sort of enthusiastic. So amongst other things, they might be more politically engaged, younger, more urban, right? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Sometimes retired because they have time to do things like fill out surveys. with phone, it's a lot harder to know, and nobody signed up for your phone-based survey, right? And so you're going to have to dial and dial and dial. So I would say, like, I would expect in like a phone survey that you're going to get a 90% non-response rate, right? So if you want 100, you're dialing 1,000 numbers, right? So if you're wanting 400, you're dialing 4,000 or 5,000 numbers to get that.
We should expect a minimum of 4 times the.
Yeah, I think for like an internet-based survey, that's probably pretty fair. And obviously, like phone is going to be higher. Mail, I don't even know. I would expect like a 2% response rate by mail, but I'm just guessing. I haven't ever done it, and almost no one does phone-based or mail-based stuff anymore, except the federal government. And they'll be like, you have to fill out the census, or you are a criminal, right? Not quite, but does that answer your question? But yeah, again, the platform depends a lot, or it depends a lot on the platform. Internet's probably the best, but again, it's the most biased sample that you get. It's never going to be truly random. I would say almost always it's a non-probability sample of some kind, and I'll talk about what they are, because I've got the non-probability ones coming up. But does that make sense? Did I answer your question? Okay, perfect. Oh, there's another part of this slide. Yes. Yeah, I mean, this one's hard to know, right? This second point here, is there some particular issue common to non-responders that makes them different from those who participate? It's a really good question to ask, but it's really, really hard to know. Why? Because they're non-responders. You don't know anything about them. You haven't gathered any data, so it can be really hard. Like, unless, in creating your kind of sample frame, you have like a really good sense of who people are. Like I said, if you had every student at the U of A and you knew which faculties they were in, and you saw that engineers aren't answering, you could make some assumptions as to why this is happening. But most of the time, it's just a mystery, right? You have no idea why someone wouldn't be answering your research tool, the survey that you're doing. So it can be, if you can figure it out, you might be able to account for it, but probably it's going to be really difficult. The more heterogeneous your population is to, the bigger sample size you're going to need. Obviously homogeneous populations, right? I don't know, like let's say you were, for shits and giggles, let's say you were surveying people in Iceland, right? People in Iceland are very homogeneous in terms of things like, race and ethnicity, skin color, right? Personal histories, socioeconomic class. It's a very homogeneous society on the whole. So you could probably get away with a very small sample in Iceland, right? Now, if you go to Southern Florida, right, with a tremendously diverse population, racially mixed, ethnically diverse, so a whole bunch of socioeconomic classes. In order to truly get a representative sample, you're going to need a much bigger sample, right? So I mean, or even like the United States, right? If you look at the United States or Canada as countries, right, very big populations, very diverse along all sorts of measures. And so you will typically need to get a representative sample, pretty large samples. I think mostly for national polling, 1,500 is sort of the, I can write. 1,500 is sort of the minimal one that I've seen. I've seen polls as small as 900, but 1,500 is probably a good number. And then like 3,000 or above, is definitely really good for getting a representative sample nationally. Again, with certain caveats that you want to make sure, you'd probably be doing kind of strata sampling to make sure you get every province and every territory. Okay. Or every state, right? So you get at least a sample from everywhere. You're not getting, 90% of your sample from California and Texas. Okay. Like I said, the kind of analysis you're going to do and you're wanting to do, if you know beforehand, and you probably should have a plan of what kind of analysis you're going to do, it's probably going to kind of change the sample size as well, right? For some, you might need a much bigger sample size. For others, you might need a small one, right? Yeah, small population, if you're going to compare it to a larger group, it might be necessary to oversample the smaller group to make meaningful comparisons, right? So you might have to get a larger part of like a subpopulation in order to make meaningful comparisons. So I don't know, if you're looking at, let's say, Filipino people in Edmonton versus the general population of Edmonton, you might need to oversample Filipino people a little bit in order to make a comparison to the broader population, just to make sure you're getting enough, right? So that you're getting somewhere in around, let's say 100 or 400 Filipino people. This ends up being a problem sometimes in certain studies where you want to get a truly representative sample. I think here of like the General Social Survey in the US, right? So this is this big study that's out of NORC, the National Opinion Research Center at University of Chicago. And one of the things it's used a lot for religion research. And one of the things that's frustrating about it is with that sample, right? If you get sometimes you get like Hindus, right? And you have maybe 1% of your sample being Hindus, but the sample is only 1,500 people, right? So you don't have enough Hindus, and this happens with Jews as well. Jews and Muslims and Hindus, Sikhs all end up being sort of too small to make meaningful comparisons to other things. You just don't have enough people in the sample, right? What's 1% of 15 people, right? So you've had 15 Hindus in a 1,500 person sample. It's just not big enough. If you were wanting to really think about, how Hindus compare to the rest of that population, you'd have to pull in at least 100, right? And then you'd be massively oversampling them as a proportion of your total population. And this happens with lots of really small population groups, right? It can be really difficult to be like, this ethnic or racial group, it's very small, so we only got like 10 of them in the sample. We can't really say much about them other than these 10 individuals, which we know are not representative, think this, right? So you have to be careful there too, and sometimes this is a bit of a problem with even relatively well-respected samples like the GSS, right? The total number is pretty small, so it might not capture subgroups. If you want to say something about a small subgroup, you might have to oversample that group to a pretty, well, in this case, like 100 out of 1,500 would be a very unreasonable. It would skew your whole sample in really weird ways. So you'd have to. It doesn't work for the GSS, but in other samples, right? If you wanted to say something about subgroups, you would have to oversample them, and then use kind of statistics to weight those things back down to the level of their population, right? So, so it wouldn't skew your national results. You could put a weight on it that kind of brings it back down. But that's fancy statistics that you can learn somewhere else. And yeah, for certain statistical procedures, multivariate regressions and such, you need relatively large samples. And like I said, the sort of minimum is about 400. But you should probably go bigger if you want to do a lot of really complex statistics on your sample, because above that, sampling error is going to be smaller and you're going to have more data to work with, more cases to compare in your multivariate regression. Okay, so the next ones, these are all these are all kind of non-statistical samples, right? Or non-representative sampling methods. All of these basically are ways of getting a sample, but they're all going to contain significant, like the next three are all going to contain significant sampling error, because sometimes these are ways of just getting some data and then sort of trying to figure out what's going on. And often I think really useful for beginners and people just starting out in social research, especially if you have limited means. So the first one, and this is, non-probability sampling, convenience sampling. You see convenience sampling done a lot in qualitative research, and I would say most of the time when you're talking about qualitative research, almost everybody ends up with some kind of convenience sample. And convenience sampling is super easy to understand. What is it? It's basically whoever is available, right? You just sample whoever is available, whoever will talk to you. The cases are included not because they're representative, not because you've done any fancy schmancy math or anything like that, is you're just looking for people to take your take your survey or do an interview with you or whatever, and you're just looking to get to a particular number. Right, so if you remember a few weeks ago, I think I was telling you that someone from the Department of Psychology at University of Calgary put this survey on Reddit, right? And it was about marriage and infidelity, right? And it was just about, basically, they're trying to recruit people in the cheapest way possible, so they're posting it on social media. That is going to end up giving you a convenience sample, right? Because you've done nothing in terms of probability sampling to assure that you're getting a random sample. You've basically just thrown it out there, and you're probably going to say, look, we're looking for 500 people to answer this survey, and we'll basically take the first 500 that answer the survey for us. So why was my case included in that particular sample? Because I answered it, right? So if you ever saw, like, someone put up like a poster and it's like, hey, do you have an elementary school child that has ADHD? We want to talk to you, right? You see these around the university from time to time. Those all end up being convenience samples, right? So convenience sampling, again, I think if you talk to like a hard quantitative researcher, they're going to be like, convenience samples are garbage because they're non-probability, right? They're not representative, and that's the biggest problem with them, right? There's no way that you're going to be able to generalize your results to a larger population using convenience sampling, because you have no way of guaranteeing that your sample represents anything close to the population, right? You haven't randomized it, you just take whoever comes. Increasingly, right, I think a lot of online, the textbook says, right, it's convenient. They're used for pilot studies. I think increasingly in a lot of cases, because we find it so difficult to get people to respond to social research, right, a lot of samples end up being convenience samples, right? It's like you put it up on your online platform on Leger or Abacus or Angus Reid or whoever it happens to be, and you just kind of wait for people to come and do the survey, right? That ultimately is a kind of convenience sample, right? Whoever was willing to do your survey within your online panel. So a lot of these are going to end up being non-probability, but sometimes it's the best we can kind of hope for. Okay. Snowball sampling. Again, snowball sampling, you want to keep this in mind for the second major lab when you have to figure out what kind of qualitative sampling method you're going to be talking about. Because snowball sampling is principally a qualitative sampling method. And it's, again, it's a form of convenience sampling. It's nothing too complicated. Basically, snowball sampling, the metaphor is the snowball rolling down the hill, right? So you make a snowball, that's your first interview. You push it down the hill and it picks up snow on the way down. Essentially, what you do with a convenience sample is you make contact with somebody who, might be willing to talk to you. And then it's kind of like, what is it? The multi-level marketing. It's the multi-level marketing approach to social research, right? So you know how if you have someone from Tupperware or Cutco or Epicure or one of these multi-level marketing firms come into your house and they present you with all of their fabulous spices or Tupperware containers. And then at the end of it, they're like, would you be willing to refer me to any of your friends, right? Would they like to do a Tupperware or an Epicure party, do you think? Or would you like to, if they ask the people at your party, would you like to host one of these? You'll get lots of fabulous prizes and stuff, right? That's essentially snowball sampling, right? So at the end of an interview with someone, you ask them, hey, do you know any of your friends or colleagues or anyone who might also be willing to talk to me? And would you mind, passing me their contact information? So you basically build your sample by, collecting, by collecting people from your first few sources, right? And you just keep kind of rolling that sample down the hill until you run out, until there's no one else to talk to, right? Until all of your contacts have been exhausted, and then you either try and find new contacts or you just stop, right? Yeah, so like I said, it's like multi-level marketing, basically. Students who participate in the studies are asked to come up with the names of some non-students who might be willing to participate, right? And you just keep going, you phone those people or contact them by email, and kind of keep that ball rolling for as long as possible. Okay, sorry, does that all make sense? I mean, it's like it said, it's very straightforward. And like I said, this is principally or qualitative. So when you get to the qualitative major lab, definitely kind of think about both convenience sampling and snowball sampling as possibilities. Okay, quota sampling. So quota sampling, you collect a specified number of cases in particular categories to match the proportion of cases and categories in the population, right? So basically, you're wanting to interview Edmontonians, and from the Edmonton City Census that, 40% or 50% of the population is white, and they're stratified into these age groups. So you go and you do your sample, right? Maybe you use an online panel and you collect X number, and you're thinking your sample is going to be 400. So you collect 200 white people in those different categories, right? Now, you don't care kind of who they are. You're not randomizing them in any way, right? You're basically just saying, when I get enough, French Canadians as a proportion of the population, then I stop, right? I've hit the quota for French Canadians, and when I hit enough Black people, and when I hit enough, Asian people, depending on how you kind of break up the population and how you've defined it, right? You just grab, 200 white people, 15 Muslims, whatever it happens to be, and you don't really care as much who they are, right? And you're not randomly sampling, you're just collecting whoever you can get. Yeah, please.
What if some people have two samples? Like, what if a person is white and
An interesting question. Theoretically, I'm trying to think. I've never done a quota sample, so I'm trying to think how that would work. I think theoretically you would have to have them classed in such ways as your categories would be non-overlapping, or maybe it counts for both, right? But if you're going by race and ethnicity, you'd have to stick to that category. If you're going by religion, then you're talking Catholics and Muslims rather than race. You might collect information about race as well, but you wouldn't be able to use categories where those would overlap in such a way as to potentially confuse your quota, right? Yeah, they have to be as mutually exclusive as you can make them, right? So you wouldn't want to mix and match, say, ethnicity and religion, right? Those would be things that aren't, where there can be some overlaps. You'd want to make sure that you're not doing that. But you could do, religion and religion, right? So you could have, you want, 30% of the population's Catholic. You want 30% being Catholic, out of 100 people, right? 30 Catholics, 15 Muslims, 40 Protestant, or whatever. I don't remember the proportions of the population in Edmonton, but you would grab it kind of like that, and 10 Hindus or whatever it happens to be. But yeah, you're right in noting that if you mix and match kind of racial and other categories, that could be a problem where some people might be both, and then that would confuse your quota. So you'd have to make sure your quota categories kind of make sense and wouldn't have that spillover. So does that make sense? Okay. Great. What was I saying? Random methods are not used to fill quotas. So it is not a probability sample. So likely when you go to publish, you will have to explain that to someone that you've got a non-probability sample, and that basically, you're not, at the end of the day, your sample is not truly randomized, and that's fine, right? Again, none of these are wrong. They all just require a justification for why you use this particular sample. A lot of times, even on the major lab, just for simplicity's sake, depending on what you're talking about, I do recommend people use a quota sample, right? That they go with a quota sample as their basic methodology, simply because it's really, really easy to say, okay, this is the population that I'm interested in studying. This is how it breaks down. So I'm going to get this many people from each of these groups, and that's going to be my sample. And I accept that it's not completely randomized, but it's as close as I'm going to be able to get, right? So, even student populations, right? I'm going to not randomize them because I don't have everybody's student numbers at U of A. So I'm just going to get, out of my sample of 100 students, I'm going to get 30 engineers because, a third of the student population is engineers, right? Or 33, right? You can do that, and you then can say, I'm sort of randomized, or not randomized, it's not truly random, but I've got, the same proportions as, say, the overall population. But the way I selected the sample was quota sampling rather than a random sample method. So it's not truly representative, but you're still in range, I think. Does that make sense? Sorry. Okay. Strengths of quota sampling, right? Cheaper, easier to manage compared to random sampling. Random sampling can get really complicated. So it's just like, this is not an example to make fun of anyone, but I didn't go, but we had researchers over at Edmonton Remand Center, and the plan was to do simple random sampling. So, every inmate had been assigned a random number because we had the list of who they were, and then we were going to sample them randomly, based on this. And when we got there, apparently the correctional officers said, no, you're not doing that. You're just going to get whoever we give you. So, it sort of got switched to quota sampling, essentially, at the end of the day. So, not a big deal. But yeah, it's cheaper, easier to manage, and you don't have to worry about, making sure your sample is truly random. You can just say, this is what we were able to get, and this is how it works. Yeah, you can conduct it much more quickly than random sampling, and it doesn't require as much kind of mathematical trickery to figure it out, or rejecting people that might potentially be willing to talk to you, but that wouldn't be one of the random numbers generated in simple random sampling. Yeah, I mean, I think increasingly, right, it says good for pilot tests and exploratory research. I think increasingly, because of the way we're gathering data, it's becoming much more common, even though people might not be entirely willing to say that that's what they're doing. And obviously weaknesses, right? Not likely to be representative. You might get the eligibility incorrect, right? A researcher might misjudge a person's age, mistakenly avoid a person. This doesn't happen online, but let's say you were doing it in a quota sample in another way, like in person, you could misjudge characteristics, or you can have what Joan is talking about, where you have someone that fits two categories, and it could be difficult to judge. And yeah, you cannot calculate a standard error or really a sampling error when you're talking about, or bias when you're talking about a quota sample, because it's not randomly, you didn't get it randomly, so you just don't know. Okay, we'll talk about structured observation. That's the next unit. Just very quickly, structured observation generally involves making kind of very detailed observations using very clear codes of real-world situations. It's not the most interesting research method, in my opinion, but it's definitely one that's been used in certain circumstances. I'll tell you about, because I have structured observation in the next unit. One of the problems is, right, there's no sampling frame, right? There's often no sampling frame. So let's say you wanted to observe an emergency room, right? You don't have a list of who was there, right? If you're in a public space, I don't know, like a playground, and you want to do a structured observation of how children interact, right? People may be coming and going, so you don't have a sampling frame. It may involve time sampling, right? So you might, if you're in an emergency room or at a playground, right? You might sample it at 3 random times. You may be observing it at 3 random times during the day, right? To try and get maybe you do it first thing in the morning, right? And then midday, and then late at night to see what the differences are, say in an emergency room or at the playground, like early in the morning, around lunch and after school, right? So you can sample things at either random or non-random times. Place sampling, right? You can do a study of, student activities on campus, or just be in a place, right? So dining hall, a pub, especially public places. And behavior sampling, you might want to look at every 5th interaction between students and librarians at a reference desk, right? To try and randomize what interactions you're seeing. I mean, I don't know how often people, what did I do? I don't know how often people do these really, really structured observations anymore. Feels like much more of a tool of psychology, but I'm sure it probably happens. It seems like a very administrative way. of doing things, which makes me think it's probably more common in the United States, which does tend to have these much more rigid sort of ways of doing things. Okay. Sorry. I need to remember to kind of put these on higher contrast. There we go. That'll be better. Okay, yeah, generalization. Obviously what sociologists want to do most of the time is make generalizations about a population, right? Even when you select the sample using probability sampling, right, you can still only say things about that population, right? So you can't, even if you randomly sampled Edmontonians, you can only make generalizations about Edmontonians. You couldn't then go and say, probably people in Toronto are exactly the same as Edmonton, right? So even when you have probability sampling, it only applies to the population from which the sample was taken. That's obvious, right? You can't survey Europeans and say that this equally applies to the United States, right? You have to put limitations on how you generalize. And yeah, I mean, do the findings of an earlier date still apply today? Society is an ever-changing, kind of organic thing. And so, something from even a few years ago might not be true today. And especially if you go through a sort of, major social change, something like COVID, right, may scramble all of the things that you thought were true when you did if you did something in 2019, in 2022, after COVID may no longer be kind of valid. Okay. So, causes of error or sampling problems. So obviously we talked about sampling and sampling related errors, right? In kind of, errors that you can have, right? You choose an incorrect sample frame, or for whatever reason you end up grabbing a non-probability sample and there's a lot of bias or error in it. Data collection errors, right? So especially when human beings are the ones doing the data collection, right? Inter-observer or inter-interviewer kind of differences in how people record data could theoretically cause errors in what your data ultimately looks like at the end of the day. People entering information incorrectly, right? Even people doing surveys at home, internet-based surveys or other text-based surveys that they fill out themselves, misunderstanding questions could enter, into the problem, or could enter a certain degree of error into your data. And data processing errors, there's a couple that can happen, right? If someone, say, is inputting, data from a written survey in and puts it in wrong, that's a data kind of entry or data processing error. If you're working with, say, something like SPSS or R or Stata or Python, right, and you process the data incorrectly, you set up the code book wrong, these sorts of things, right? You get the codes wrong. This can put in kind of data processing errors where suddenly your data doesn't make sense simply because you've incorrectly inputted something or created an error in the way the data is being understood. So all of those things, and usually this should get caught in peer review, right? When someone goes to peer review an article and they look at your data, they should pick up on that, but it doesn't always happen. Okay. Sorry, I just want to. All right, I got 3. I just want to see how many slides I had left. Okay, content analysis. So content analysis is a different form of analysis. So we're now out of survey research. Content analysis is a little bit different, and it's not it's not a terribly common type of data of kind of quantitative analysis anymore. It used to be really common, again, especially in the US, that people would do quantitative content analysis, which basically is mostly just counting, right? Like all quantitative research, but it's mostly when you talk about quantitative content analysis, right? So you find some source of data. It was really common in the past to do like newspaper articles or online articles from news sources, and to look for certain things. You still see it occasionally, I suppose, and you can do it easily using LexisNexis. But basically, you're looking at particular types of media and usually looking for either keywords, phrases, or themes in that media, right? So, for instance, people have done in kind of recent years looks at, things like the use of kind of terms related to gender theory and how, it used to be, if you go back to the 1980s, it was barely not present at all in, say, major US publications. And over time, it's sort of increased, right? So that is a kind of quantitative, you're like, okay, how often do people talk about gender or, someone being transgender, assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth? You can put all these terms into a program called NexusLexis, and it'll spit out how many times this appeared in media sources. Right, so how would you do this, right? Basically, there's sort of two ways you could do it. What kind of media you want to sample in terms of quantitative analysis? Are you talking newspaper, online, magazines, television? What media are you going to look at, and how are you then going to sample it, right? So, articles on a given topic from certain publications, right? That's basically how you would look at creating a sample for your quantitative content analysis. And then usually, you do a kind of mix of these two. So what media are you sampling and what dates are you interested in? And like I said, there's a program called NexusLexis that you can just punch these things into, and you can say, like, I'm interested in seeing how often the New York Times used the phrase, transgender, starting in the year 1970 and ending in the year 2023, right? And then it would just give you, it would show you every article that used the word transgender, and it would usually plot it on a graph. So it would show you numerically how often it happened, and you can split it up into whatever dates you want. Yeah, please.
Is there a way to correct for changing terminology? Like in the example of transgender, right? Like trans people have always existed, but it's not always been the terminology for that, right? Like in other past decades, they would use
transvestite or yeah.
Whatever else happens to be the thing at the time, right? So a thing like that, you would manually.
So you can search for multiple terms, right? So you can set a range of terms that you want to, and if you have a sense of what terms were used in the past, right? You can set I can't remember how many. It's been a while since I used NexusLexis. I think it's 100 terms. You can search for 100 terms at a time, right? So if you had 100 terms related to a particular thing, right? You could throw that all in and be like, yeah, I know that, in the 1970s, whatever, this was the term that was used, or, cross-dresser or whatever, right? So you could include all of those things in the sample. I've seen a lot more people kind of interested in when a particular sort of idea became germane. The transgender one, I think is interesting because, that particular term has increased really in the past 25 years, pretty arithmetically, and before that it was very uncommon. So people have used this as evidence that the discourse around this phenomenon has changed, right? But yeah, you can set, I think it's 100 terms in NexusLexis that you can set. You'd have to have that pre-existing knowledge. I don't think it has any related term function, but like I said, it's been maybe 8 years since I used it. So they may have, and maybe AI can figure that out for us now. But yeah, it's generally you can set a lot of terms at the same time just to see, how often they've been used. It's not the most, I don't like this kind of research because I find it quite, I don't know, the frequency of words or phrase used is not always the most interesting to me. There's also thematics, right? NexusLexis also includes a category on thematics. So you can ask it to look for articles on this theme, and most of them have been categorized by the publishers themselves as these themes are covered so that it's easy to search for things in NexusLexis. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what term you would use for that particular one that we're talking about, but I'm sure there is a kind of blanket thematic term that you could search for in a system like that. Does that make sense? Okay, perfect. Yeah, sampling dates. I think that's simple, right? Yeah, if you're researching media portrayals of sex workers, you could use a random method selecting the years which the media are to be analyzed, or just set a range, right, and find as many articles through this period as possible, and just kind of count them and figure out what the themes were. Like I said, I don't love this kind of research, and coming from something of a media studies background, I always found this kind of research only mildly enlightening and not all that interesting. But I was always more of a qualitative media person anyway, or content analyst person anyway. And I was more interested in kind of deep dives into the content than just being like, wow, in 1994, there were 75,000 articles on youth crime, most of them having this overarching theme, right? So, but that's basically how you would do qualitative content analysis. And again, LexisNexis is the big one that people use. Yeah, reducing non-response. For phone, yeah, it's really difficult, right? It's really difficult, especially now, given the fact that most people, like on the phone, most people just don't answer phone calls from people they don't know, right? From numbers they don't know, because we all get so many calls from people we don't know. And it's mostly, what is it? This is Joe from Windows and Doors. And I'm like, oh, you again. I get this one all the time. It's like a random dial, or they tell me they're from TELUS, and they're like, oh, you can get your new TELUS phone. I'm like, yeah, I don't have a TELUS cell phone, so I don't know who you're calling. I mean, typically, if you want to do it, callbacks are usually necessary. Right now, I think I had one from Tel City Hall, which is a polling firm, and they phoned me like 8 times, and I haven't picked up yet. Yeah, because there's just like, you have to follow back until you wear people down and they pick up the phone. So yeah, callbacks, you might have to phone numbers repeatedly to reduce non-response. Again, this is why people don't do phone polling anymore. It's really difficult. What's that? Well, you have no way of knowing that, right? Or does it go, I've never been blocked. I don't think I've ever had my number blocked. So does it just like be like, you are blocked? I have no idea. But I think it would just keep ringing, right? And the person, it would just never receive the call. Oh no, my battery is dying. I thought I would make it through an entire day of lecturing with no need to plug in my laptop. We are almost done. I'm going to plug it in anyway, just so it doesn't die, because that messes with the stream. That's more my concern. Sometimes it deletes the stream if I do that. Huzzah. Okay, I'm good. And I had the charger right here. Yeah, I mean, reassuring prospective participants that you're not out for material gain, right? You're not doing it for the money. That can help. Face-to-face contact, right? Dressing appropriately and accommodating participants. But like I said, it's really rare now that you're ever going to do this kind of like research. In terms of quantitative research, when you do qualitative research, totally different story. Most of it is face-to-face, but you barely do these anymore. And like I said, mailed questionnaires almost never happen anymore either. The government is almost the only one that can do mailed questionnaires now. But yeah, and all of these things are from a kind of a different era of research, and they're still included in the textbook because the textbook isn't, there's certain things that aren't 100% up to date, but they're still there, right? So good cover letters, always good. Make it personal by including their name and address, and it should be personally signed. Obviously, that very rarely happens, but you might print your signature on the paper. Mailed questionnaire should be have a stamped return envelope. Again, this is a reason that people don't do this anymore. Sending out hundreds of stamped envelopes is really expensive now, so people don't do it as much anymore. Don't allow the questionnaire to be too bulky, right? If the envelope's too thick, people will just throw it away. It seems daunting. That's why now if someone's sending something out in the mail, it has a QR code and directs them to a website. And yeah, you might have to send 2 or 3 further mailings, which again, just brings the money. And yeah, monetary incentives can increase the response rate, but can be deemed unethical. But I mean, sometimes it doesn't take much, right? Like I know I think it was, I can't remember which firm it was that was doing media research, and I basically did it for $2, right? I did they mailed a toonie in the envelope, and they're like, here's a shiny toonie if you fill out our survey, and I took the toonie and I did their survey. So it was all good. Okay. What's that? No, my daughter did take the toonie and didn't, because they mailed one to her too, and she didn't do the survey, and she took the toonie anyway. And there's nothing they can do because they mailed it to you, and now it's your toonie. But the idea is, I think they're counting on your politeness, like, oh, they mailed me money, well, I better do their survey, right? But I think this one was funny because as you did more of them, and I did 3. And every time the amount of money increased. And so by the last time I did it, they had mailed me $5. And then I just took the $5 and I didn't do the survey because I was like, I'm kind of done with this. Like, I've filled out this survey several times and I don't want to do this anymore. So I then just took the money and ran. And then they didn't mail me any more money. Go figure. Well, I mean, at one point, I did enough of these surveys on Leger. And then I would just get $20 Visa gift cards every time I had enough points. And I saved enough to buy a PlayStation, which is how I got my PlayStation. But that took me almost a year of doing like 2 surveys a day. And after that, I was like, this is a waste of my time. But I did get a PlayStation out of it. So it's all good. Okay, virtual sampling issues. I've been talking about this, nonstop, so I won't belabor it. Yeah, technical ability. That's less of a question now because I think everybody's more or less accustomed to it. But, it could still be a problem, especially older people might not be as open to doing online surveys as younger people. They might not, access the platforms in the same way. Yeah, especially now, like internet users are a somewhat biased proportion of the population, right? Especially people with, although it's a little bit different. The internet has evened out with smartphones, so you can't say that as much anymore. But generally speaking, right, they have been historically slightly richer, a little bit better educated, more urban than rural on the whole. And especially, yeah, you can't really set up a sampling frame for the general online population. So it's hard to do random sampling of any kind. And once you get into, the last maybe 10 years, and these online panels, which are all deeply flawed, but they're the only way for us to get any kind of response from people. Essentially, we're in a situation where you're getting, not random, but biased samples that are not completely randomized online, essentially for convenience sake and for, sanity and cost. Getting truly random samples is really, really difficult and really, really complicated. So increasingly, we're relying on these biased online frames. Okay, now, see, this is the dilemma. I have 15 minutes left. Do you want me, and you are all here and you get to choose because there's like 7 of you. All right, 8, 5, 7, 8. There were 9 before. Do you want to start on the next unit, or do you just want to have I beaten you to death with talking about probability sampling and you just want to go? And it's ready, it's right here. Oh, no, it's right somewhere. Not there. I swear I opened it before I came to class. Oh, there it is. Structured observation. It's just not working for whatever reason. Do you want to do 2 slides or 5 slides of structured observation? There's 22 of them total. I can probably get through it on Wednesday. You just want to go?
How far along are we?
Well, we're pretty close. Basically, we have 1 unit left. It's structured observation. I just have to find, I don't know why it didn't open properly. Structured observation. There it is. You already put your laptop away. It doesn't matter to me. I'm ready to go. I could talk about it all day. What's that? Have pity on them. I scorn them openly. No, I don't care. But I understand. It's a weird time of the semester too. Okay, well, since none of you are super enthusiastic, I will blast through structured observation on Wednesday. I should be able to get it all done. It's not a super dense unit, and I can get through it really quickly. So we'll just let you go. Yeah, I could do that. It's actually only 7 or 16 slides, so I can easily get through that on Wednesday. So have fun. We'll see you on Wednesday. That'll be it for content up to the first midterm. And I will spend the rest of this time organizing my YouTube so that people can find